So we spoke extensively about lab testing, and obviously lab testing is not something that is available to everybody. And it can also be quite disruptive of our training, and might not be something that you want to use. And coming from Africa, I did a lot of my coaching without the benefit of labs, even though we have some good exercise physiology labs there. As a school teacher and a coach of high school cross country and track athletes, I couldn't be popping everybody in a bus and going down to a sports science lab and paying $200-300 per athlete to have them all tested. So I made extensive use of field testing, and evaluating ourselves is something that the high-level runner and high-level endurance athlete is much better at than the average athlete. And we tend to avoid discovering where we are. And if we don't know where we are, it's really, really hard to aim at a certain performance. I've found that when people approach me, they're very clear of the kind of result they want and what they want to achieve. But when I ask them what their best times are, they have a sense of those. But what their current status is, they don't like that. If I say to an athlete, all right, what's your current 5K shape? They say they don't know, and I'm saying, well, are you fit? And they say, well, you're reasonably fit. And I say, okay, well, let's go down to the track tomorrow and do a workout that gives us a sense of where you are at with the 5K, especially in terms of your training pace. And then they ask for time to train or something like that. We tend to want to avoid that. That's kind of confronting. I understand that. And so let's have a look at how we can utilize some field tests to find out what's going with us. All right. So many of the field tests, if you have controlled your variables pretty well, in other words, you're using a track and you're choosing a time of day where the temperature is good, and you also, controlling things like wind, you're not doing these evaluations on windy days, and you're creating this, the similar kind of stress expectations that they might expect in races, or that they would expect from a lab test. You can get very, very similar results, but just be aware that there are more variables out there. But to find out what people's training paces are, not difficult to do at all. I give a pretty extensive explanation in my book, Run Workouts for Runners and Triathletes, how you can determine all your varying training paces. The other thing to look at too is what are your favorite sessions? And how frequently do you do them? So these are your benchmark sessions. So while it's a workout and while it's improving your fitness, it's also giving you a lot of feedback, both in terms of physiological data, pace data, emotional response, confidence, and also mentally where your training's at. So those favorite sessions are good ones to have. Again, look at those training sessions from a perspective that you can walk away from them and come back at training quite quickly. You don't want to be going out and doing a 25-mile time trial to find out what your marathon shape is in, or even anything more than 15 miles. That's pretty demanding for most of us. All right, so be careful how you choose those test sets. The other thing to look at is your favorite race distance. So if you look on a performance prediction chart, and there's a number of them online, I really like what Greg McMillan's doing on his site with his race time prediction tables and training pace suggestions and so on. So worth looking at that, macmillanrunning.com. Is to look at what your favorite race distance is, the race distance that you tend to do best at, and then go and have a look at, say your best race distance is a 10K, and on a chart your 10K is much, much better than your 5K and way better than your marathon. And try and find out, is that something to do with your muscle type, with your personality type, or is it just your type of training? In other words, you're pretty well trained to go for, whatever your 10K time is, 35 or 45 or 55 minutes. You're pretty well trained to do that, but you're only running, say, 20 miles a week or 30 miles a week. And so you're not doing enough volume for that ability that you displayed in 10K to translate to the marathon or to the longer races. All right, so that's an important thing to look at as well. The other thing is to look at the kind of race that you like. Do you like trail running? Do you like cross-country running? Do you like rolling hilly courses? Do you like hot, humid courses? Do you like flat, fast, cool courses? Those will also point towards certain things. Some people have fantastic physiology and their mechanics are not so good, or their running skill is not so good. So they do really, really well on tough courses. All right, but when the speed's too high, they just don't have the mechanics to maintain that speed, even though they might have the physiology to do that, both central and peripheral. So look at that. And so something that I use very much in terms of field testing is something called fatigue index. All right, and your fatigue index, and I'll talk about it much more in detail at a later stage, but your fatigue index, just in terms of testing yourself, is a very useful tool. It basically tells you how much do you slow down with each doubling of distance? You know, so in other words, your 5K pace versus your 10K pace. How much slower is your 10K pace? And you typically find with high-end triathletes, you know, they get about as low as 5%. So they slow down about 5% with each doubling of distance. But some high-end runners are in the low 2% range. In other words, they slow down a little less, all right, the specific runners. But if, for example, if your fatigue index between your 5 and your 10K is, say, 6 or 7, and your fatigue index between your 10K and your marathon is 11 or 12, then it's just pointing towards you having a very low endurance. And so it's a good way to look at that. And your fatigue index is also a good way for you to see, you know, if you have a nice low fatigue index in your power events, all right, you might be more suited to those. Okay, and so if you look at somebody like Usain Bolt, he has a much higher fatigue index between his 100 and his 200 than, say, a top marathon runner would have between their half marathon and their marathon. All right, and so the power type athletes have a higher fatigue index, and the endurance type athletes have a lower fatigue index.